Right, our next lesson will be about bond strings in covalent bonds. Now, we'll also be looking at the bond length. If we look at covalent bonding, we see that when we have single covalent bond, the bond length is much greater than in double covalent bonding when there's two, or in triple covalent bonding. So we see that the distance between the two elements becomes shorter or closer. There's a shorter distance between them because when the number of bonds increase, the bond strength increases. That means that one element is going to be attracted to another one by a stronger force, and they get pulled closer and closer together. So in single covalent, because the strength of the bond is not that high as in, for example, in a triple covalent bond, the distance between the elements is going to be shorter. So the greater the bond, the more bonds you have. So triple covalent bonds will be short bonds and very strong bonds. Single covalent bonds will be long bonds and they'll be weaker. They're easier to break. Double covalent a little bit more difficult to break than single, but still easier to break than a triple covalent bond. So it's very important that you understand that the length of the bond is going to affect the strength of the bond. The greater the length, the weaker the strength is going to be, because they're not so close together. They're further apart. The force with which they're attracting each other is weaker, so that's why they will be further apart. So the longer the bond length, the smaller the bond strength, the less the strength of the bond. You also know that when we did this with the toothpicks, it was much easier to break one toothpick than three short toothpicks. Even the length made it more difficult to break. If you had three normal sized toothpicks, it was easier to break them than three short ones. The shorter the bond length becomes, the more energy you need to break those bonds. So if we look at bond energy, then we see that the energy change that occurs when bonds form or break is called energy. So you need energy to break the bonds, but you also need energy to form bonds. And in this process, energy is released when bonds are formed. So when you take two elements and you combine them onto each other, then there's energy that is released when they form this bond. If you want to break the bonds between two elements in a substance, then you need to add energy to break the bonds. Now, this concept is something that you are going to explore further in grade 11, when you will look at exothermic and endothermic reactions in deeper or in greater strength. Now that brings us to what happens, what type of reactions I have. So I've just mentioned that this is related to endothermic and exothermic reactions. An endothermic reaction is a reaction where you have to put heat in to break it. Now, one way of remembering this is when you go to the movies or even at school, when you walk into a room, there's a signboard at the top that says entrance. Now, enter means to go in. So endothermic is when heat is put into a reaction. On the other side, exothermic is when you exit a building. It means you go out of the room, you leave it. So exothermic is when heat is released out of the reaction. Now, if you go back to this, we said that to break bonds, energy is needed. To make bonds, energy is needed. So energy is released when bonds form. Now that means if you take two elements and you combine them together, heat is going to be given off, exothermic. Energy is added to break bonds. It means if you take a substance like, say, mercury oxide, and you want to break it up into mercury and oxygen again, then you are going to have to add energy to make them, to help them to break up. So you need to understand what is an endothermic reaction and what is an exothermic reaction. In all chemical reactions, when you have two elements combining, you will need to put energy in, endothermic. So energy is added, And then if you have a compound and you want to break it up into the components that it was formed, you want to break the bonds between them, then it means you are going to have an exothermic reaction. Exit is when heat is given off. Right, so this concept of exothermic and endothermic is something that you will explore in more detail in grade 11.